What happens when a CEO goes undercover in his own company and witnesses a manager humiliating a veteran employee? You won't believe how he responds, right in front of everyone. Stay tuned, because this is the kind of justice you need to see. The early morning air outside Horizon Mart carried the crisp bite of autumn. But inside the massive retail store, the atmosphere felt heavier. Ethan Carter stepped through the automatic doors, blending seamlessly into the ranks of employees starting their shift. Dressed in a simple blue store vest with a printed name tag reading Ethan Reed. He looked every bit like a new hire. Just another worker trying to make a living. It was a far cry from his usual appearance, tailored suits, polished shoes, and the kind of presence that commanded respect in a boardroom. But today, he wasn't here as CEO. He was here to observe, to listen, and most importantly, to uncover the truth. For weeks, reports had trickled in, complaints from employees about mistreatment, unfair scheduling, and a toxic work environment. None of it had come through official HR channels. Instead, whispers from trusted sources had reached his desk. It wasn't enough to launch a formal investigation, but it was enough to warrant a closer look. And Ethan Carter wasn't the type to make decisions from behind a desk. He had built Horizon Mart into a national retail powerhouse through hands-on leadership. And if there was a problem brewing in his company, he was going to see it for himself. His first impression of the store wasn't particularly alarming. Employees moved quickly, restocking shelves, scanning items at the registers, assisting customers. On the surface, everything functioned as it should. But there was an undercurrent of tension. A stiffness in the way some workers avoided eye contact or hurried out of a supervisor's line of sight. Ethan was assigned to work in the stockroom, a cavernous space filled with towering metal shelves and the hum of forklifts maneuvering heavy pallets. That's where he met Jim Walker. The older man, maybe in his late 40s, had a sturdy build despite moving with a noticeable limp. His uniform was neat, his posture straight, and though he wasn't the fastest worker, he moved with precision, making sure every item was placed correctly. His hands were calloused, his forearms lined with faded scars, marks of a life spent in service. A former Marine, Ethan guessed. There was a discipline to Jim's movements, a quiet focus that reminded him of men who had spent years following orders. New guy, huh? Jim said, nodding toward Ethan's name tag. That obvious? Ethan replied with a slight grin. Jim chuckled. You still look like you're trying to figure out where everything is. Give it a week. This place has its own rhythm. Ethan was about to ask more about the store when the stockroom doors swung open with a sharp metallic clang. Daniel Brooks strode in, his expression already laced with irritation. The store manager carried himself with the air of a man who expected people to shrink in his presence. He was in his mid-40s, slightly overweight but still imposing, with a sharp gaze that scanned the room like a predator assessing his territory. His eyes landed on Jim. Walker, Brooks barked, his voice echoing off the metal shelves. You've been on this shipment for 20 minutes. Why the hell is it not done? Jim straightened, but before he could answer, Brooks scoffed, shaking his head. I swear to God, it's like watching paint dry. What, you think just because you served, we should all salute and give you extra time? This is retail, not boot camp. Ethan felt the temperature in the room drop. A few other employees in the stockroom lowered their heads, pretending to focus on their tasks. No one spoke. No one defended Jim. Brooks took a step closer, voice laced with condescension. You think you're a hero? Newsflash. Being good at war doesn't mean you're good at working. If you can't keep up, maybe you should have stayed retired. Jim clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the edge of the box he was lifting. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just took it. Ethan had to grip the handheld scanner in his pocket to keep himself from speaking up. The rage that burned in his gut was instant. But this wasn't the time. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, angling his phone just enough to press record. The camera lens caught everything. The sneer on Brooks's face, the way Jim's shoulders tensed, the uncomfortable glances from nearby employees. Ethan knew exactly what he was looking at. This wasn't an isolated incident. Brooks had done this before, probably countless times, and no one stopped him because they feared retaliation. For a moment, Brooks lingered, waiting for a response that never came. Then, with a scoff, he turned on his heel and stormed out. Jim exhaled slowly, shaking his head before returning to his task like nothing had happened. Ethan watched him for a beat longer, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. Now he had proof, but proof wasn't enough. If he wanted to take Brooks down the right way, the way that left no room for denials, excuses, or damage control, he needed more than one recording. He needed a plan. He wasn't just going to remove Brooks. He was going to make sure the entire store saw exactly who their manager really was. And for that, Ethan Reed, the new employee, would be sticking around a little while longer. Ethan had seen bad managers before. Men and women who ruled by intimidation, who measured success in fear rather than efficiency. But Daniel Brooks wasn't just bad, he was the kind of leader who thrived on belittling others. Who saw his employees not as people but as tools to be used and discarded. The more Ethan watched, the clearer it became that Brooks's abuse of power extended far beyond Jim. The stockroom was like a pressure cooker, and Brooks was the one turning up the heat. Employees were regularly pressured into taking on extra shifts without proper compensation. Some of them clocking out but still expected to work off the record. The few who dared to question this system were met with thinly veiled threats about their job security. Worse still, Ethan noticed the way Brooks interacted with the female employees. There was an air of entitlement in his words, a smug undertone whenever he made a comment that lingered just a little too long. A joke that carried an edge too sharp to be brushed off. The women working under him had learned to either laugh along uncomfortably or keep their heads down. Ethan kept quiet, biding his time, watching how the others responded. No one confronted Brooks. No one called him out. They all knew better. Then came the moment that pushed Ethan past the point of mere observation. Jim was given a nearly impossible task, moving a shipment of bulk inventory that was clearly too heavy for one person. The store had warehouse equipment for jobs like this, but for whatever reason, Jim was expected to handle it alone. Ethan saw the strain in his movements, the way his injured leg made lifting and carrying more than just a challenge. Still, Jim didn't complain. Brooks, however, was watching, and when he saw Jim struggling, instead of stepping in, he smirked. "You're really going to take all day with that?" Brooks's voice carried across the stockroom, making sure everyone heard him. Jim straightened, resting one hand on the shelf beside him. "Just need a minute," he said, his breath steady but strained. Brooks scoffed. "Pathetic. I don't know how the hell you ever kept up in the military if this is your best effort." Silence followed. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Then, Emily, one of the younger employees, no older than 25, stepped forward. She was slight but determined, her expression set with quiet defiance as she reached for the other side of the pallet. "I'll help," she said. Brooks turned on her so fast that she flinched. "Oh, you'll help, will you?" His smile was thin, cruel. "That's real sweet. But tell you what, since you're so eager to pick up the slack, I'll just dock both of your paychecks for lost productivity. Sound fair?" Emily's face went pale. Jim quickly shook his head, signaling her to step back. Brooks waited, looking between them, enjoying the moment before he walked off, leaving behind a silence thick with humiliation. Ethan exhaled slowly, every fiber of his being told him to step in, to call Brooks out right then and there. But he wasn't just here to put an end to this one incident. He was here to dismantle the entire system that let people like Brooks thrive. It was time to test just how far this man's cruelty extended. Later that afternoon, Ethan deliberately made a mistake, something small, something any new hire might slip up on. He intentionally miscounted a stack of inventory, noting the wrong number on the shipment log. It took all of 10 minutes for Brooks to find out. "What the hell is this?" Brooks stalked up to Ethan, slamming the clipboard against a nearby crate. "You think you can just write down whatever numbers you feel like?" Ethan barely had time to feign confusion before Brooks laid into him. His words sharp, designed to cut. "Jesus Christ, no wonder you're still stuck in a stockroom job at your age." Brooks sneered. "I swear, the level of incompetence in this place is astounding." Ethan didn't react. He didn't have to, because now he had exactly what he needed. Brooks didn't just target Jim. He didn't single out one employee. This was who he was. This was how he led. And soon, everyone was going to see it. That night, Ethan sat down in his motel room and began outlining his plan. The recording of Brooks berating Jim was damning. But it wasn't enough on its own. He needed more. He needed to show everyone, the employees, the higher-ups, even the board of directors, exactly what was happening inside this store. By the time he was finished, he had a plan. Tomorrow, every employee in this store would be gathered. Tomorrow, Brooks would be forced to face his own words, played back for him in front of an audience that had spent too long being afraid. And when it was over, Brooks wouldn't just lose his job, he would lose his power. Morning came with an unusual buzz across Horizon Mart. The intercom announcement had been brief but firm. All employees were to report to the main conference room before the start of their shifts. There was no explanation, no warning, just a mandatory summons that left the staff uneasy. Daniel Brooks arrived 5 minutes before the scheduled time, his usual confident stride carrying a touch of impatience. He hated disruptions to his routine, and this felt unnecessary. Meetings like these were typically reserved for upper management, not the entire store. As employees filtered into the room, their murmurs filled the air. Some exchanged nervous glances, while others whispered theories about what could be happening. Brooks folded his arms, glancing toward the front of the room where a projector screen had been set up. His annoyance deepened. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doors shut. The room fell silent as Ethan Carter walked in. The man they knew as Ethan Reed no longer looked like just another stockroom worker. His stance was more assured, his expression unreadable. He moved with the kind of quiet authority that made people take notice. Without a word, Ethan crossed the room, reached for the laptop connected to the projector, and hit play. The screen flickered to life. Brooks's voice echoed through the room, sharp and demeaning. "What, you think just because you served, we should all salute and give you extra time? This is retail, not boot camp." A heavy silence settled over the crowd as the video continued. Brooks's taunts, his sneering tone, the way Jim Walker had stood there, taking every word without a response. Some employees lowered their heads. Others glanced at Jim, their expressions shifting from discomfort to shame. Jim himself looked stunned. He hadn't known anyone had recorded that moment, let alone that it would be played in front of everyone. Brooks stiffened beside the screen, his face turning an unhealthy shade of red. Ethan let the video play to the very last second before stopping it. Then, he turned to face the room. "This," he said, his voice calm but cold, "is how your store manager speaks to his employees." No one moved, no one spoke. Then, Brooks found his voice. "This is ridiculous." His laugh was forced, brittle. "That's completely out of context. I was just trying to get him to move faster. He's slow, anyone here can tell you that." Ethan crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "So, you believe that berating an employee, humiliating them in front of their coworkers, is an acceptable management strategy?" Brooks scoffed. "I do what needs to be done. This is a business. If someone isn't pulling their weight, it affects the entire team." A few employees shifted uncomfortably. Ethan let the silence stretch just long enough. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small leather case, and placed it on the table in front of him. The ID badge inside gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The name printed on it was not Ethan Reed. It was Ethan Carter, CEO. A breathless hush fell over the room. Brooks's jaw went slack. Employees exchanged stunned glances, some covering their mouths as realization hit. Ethan let them absorb it. Then, he turned his gaze back to Brooks. "I'm not a new employee," he said evenly. "I'm not a stockroom worker. I'm the man who built this company. And for the past few days, I've been watching you run this store like a dictatorship." Brooks opened his mouth, then closed it again. Ethan took a step forward. "I have heard every word you've said to your employees. I've seen how you treat them, how you manipulate them into silence. I have seen you abuse your authority. And I can assure you, that ends today." A ripple of movement went through the crowd. A few employees nodded, some finally daring to meet Ethan's gaze. Brooks clenched his fists. "You don't understand how this place works. You sit in your office, making decisions from a distance. But you don't know what it's like on the ground." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I do now. For the first time since walking into this room, Brooks looked uneasy. Jim, still absorbing everything, barely managed to find his voice. "You're really the CEO?" Ethan glanced at him, something softer in his expression. "I am." The weight of everything hung in the air. Every employee in that room knew what was coming next. Ethan wasn't finished, and Brooks knew his time was up. Ethan let the silence stretch for a few seconds longer, giving everyone in the room time to process what had just happened. The tension was thick, the weight of his revelation still hanging over the employees like an invisible pressure. All eyes were locked on him, waiting for the next words to come out of his mouth. He took a slow breath, scanning the faces before him. Some were still in shock, others wary, uncertain of what this all meant. But there were a few, just a few, who looked relieved, as if they'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. Then, in a voice that carried through the room with unwavering authority, Ethan spoke. "A manager who does not respect his employees, who leads through intimidation rather than guidance, who thrives on fear instead of fostering teamwork, has no place in this company." The words cut through the air like a blade. Brooks went rigid. For the first time, true fear flickered across his features. Ethan turned to him, his expression calm but merciless. "Daniel Brooks, effective immediately, you are terminated from your position as store manager of Horizon Mart." For a second, the room stood still. Then, as if a dam had broken, a wave of sound erupted. Applause rippled through the crowd. It started hesitant, unsure, then grew louder. A few people clapped cautiously. Others joined in with more enthusiasm. A murmur of approval swept through the employees, some exchanging glances of disbelief, others nodding in agreement. Across the room, a woman sighed in relief, her shoulders sagging like she had been carrying a weight she never thought she could put down. Brooks, however, was anything but relieved. His face turned an ugly shade of red as he slammed his fist against the table, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the suddenly energized room. "You can't do this to me," he roared. "I've worked here for years. I built this store. I kept this place running." Ethan didn't flinch. He merely met Brooks's glare with an icy stare of his own. "And in those years, how many employees have you driven out? How many people dreaded coming to work because of you?" He gestured toward the crowd. "How many of them have been too afraid to speak up because they knew exactly what you would do if they did?" Brooks's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His gaze darted across the room, searching for allies, but there were none. No one spoke for him. No one stood up in his defense. Then, the final nail in the coffin. Ethan gave a small nod toward the entrance. Two security guards stepped inside, their presence looming behind Brooks like shadows waiting to escort a condemned man to his fate. "You have 5 minutes to collect your things," Ethan said. "After that, I expect you off the premises." The fury in Brooks's eyes burned bright, but there was no fight left in him. He looked around once more, searching for something, anything, to grab onto. But all he found were the stares of the employees who had spent years under his rule. He turned on his heel, pushing past the guards with stiff movements, his pride the only thing left intact as he stormed out of the room. The doors shut behind him, and just like that, Daniel Brooks was gone. For the first time since the meeting began, a heavy weight seemed to lift from the room. The tension that had gripped the employees began to ease, the stiff shoulders relaxing, the quiet murmurs turning into something lighter. Ethan let the moment settle before turning back to the group. But he wasn't finished yet. His gaze found Jim Walker. "Jim," Ethan said, his voice steady. Jim, who had been standing off to the side, watching everything unfold with a mix of disbelief and quiet relief, blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir?" Ethan took a step forward. "I've watched you work these past few days. You show up on time. You put in the effort. And more importantly, you treat your coworkers with respect." Jim looked unsure where this was going. "I just do my job. That's exactly why I'm offering you a promotion." The room fell silent again. This time, not in tension, but in pure shock. Jim's brow furrowed. What?" Ethan didn't waver. "Effective immediately. You will take over as the new store manager." The stunned silence was broken by a ripple of murmurs. A few employees exchanged glances. Then someone let out a short, surprised laugh. Jim, for for his part, looked utterly blindsided. "Sir, I'm not a manager. I don't know how to." "You don't need to be like Brooks," Ethan interrupted. "A real leader doesn't shout orders or humiliate people. A real leader listens, understands, and works alongside their team. And that's exactly what this store needs." Jim opened his mouth again. But whatever protest he had faded as he looked around. He wasn't just seeing the employees anymore. He was seeing the people who had been suffering under Brooks for years. The people who, for the first time, looked hopeful. And then, the applause started again. But this time, it wasn't hesitant. It was real. It was the sound of people who wanted change. Jim let out a slow breath, his hands tightening at his sides. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "I won't let you down." Ethan nodded in return. "I know you won't." As the meeting began to break apart, the energy in the room was something entirely different from when it had begun. Conversations buzzed with cautious optimism. People moved with a sense of lightness they hadn't had in years. And for the first time in a long time, Horizon Mart didn't feel like a place of fear. It felt like the start of something new. Ethan turned toward the exit. But before stepping out, he left the employees with one final message. Horizon Mart is not a place for tyrants. It will never be a place for those who abuse their power. This company was built on respect and integrity. And from this day forward, that is exactly what we will return to. Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving behind a store that was finally ready for a new beginning. The fallout from the meeting spread through the store like wildfire. Employees whispered in the break room, in the aisles, even in the stockroom where the echoes of their murmurs bounced off the steel shelves. The fact that Daniel Brooks had been fired, on the spot, no less, was shocking enough. But the real surprise was Jim Walker. People couldn't decide what to make of it. Some welcomed the change. There was a quiet relief among those who had endured Brooks's temper for too long. A few employees, like Emily, even seemed hopeful, daring to believe that maybe things would actually get better. But not everyone saw it that way. A handful of employees, those who had aligned themselves with Brooks, who had thrived under his reign, weren't happy. They gathered in hushed circles, muttering among themselves, their gazes flicking toward Jim with skepticism. To them, this was nothing more than corporate theatrics, a publicity stunt by a CEO who wanted to play hero. Jim felt all of it. The weight of their stares, the unspoken challenge in their silence, the way some employees hesitated when he gave them a task, as if waiting for him to prove he was unfit. The honeymoon period of his promotion hadn't even lasted a day. The first problem came before lunch. A delivery truck arrived with a shipment of inventory. And when Jim went to oversee it, he found that the stock was being mishandled. Items that should have been scanned in were being shoved onto the shelves without proper documentation. It was a sloppy job, either an accident or deliberate negligence. Jim didn't want to believe it was the latter. But when he confronted the employees responsible, the response was anything but apologetic. "Didn't realize we had a new sheriff in town," one of them muttered under his breath. Another just smirked and walked away. Jim clenched his jaw. Later, in the break room, he overheard a conversation. Two employees whispering near the coffee machine. "He won't last a week. He was just a stock guy. No way he knows how to run this place." Jim exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. But doubt had already crept in. That evening, after his shift ended, he found himself in Ethan's office. He hesitated at the door before finally stepping inside. Ethan sat at his desk, sorting through reports. But as soon as he saw Jim, he set them aside. Jim didn't bother with pleasantries. "I don't think I'm the right person for this job." Ethan leaned back slightly. "And why's that?" Jim shook his head, his hands resting on his hips. "A lot of them don't respect me. They don't see me as a leader. Hell, I don't even know if I see myself as one." Ethan was silent for a moment, then smiled slightly. "You think I don't see what's happening out there?" Jim looked up. Ethan continued, his tone even. "Some people want you to fail. Some are waiting for you to quit. And the rest? They don't know what to believe yet. But that's not because you're not fit to lead. It's because you're changing something they've gotten used to. That makes people uncomfortable." Jim let out a short breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know, Ethan. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Ethan studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Quieter this time. You were a soldier, weren't you? Jim hesitated, then nodded. Then you know better than anyone. Fighting through resistance isn't about proving yourself in a single moment. It's about showing up every day, even when the odds are against you. The respect you want? It's not going to be given to you overnight. You earn it, step by step. Jim didn't respond right away, but something in his expression shifted. He wasn't convinced, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, he was willing to try. As he left Ethan's office, his mind was still filled with doubt, but what neither of them knew was that someone else had been watching. Mark Evans stood near the hallway, his arms crossed as he listened to Jim's footsteps fade. Mark had been Brooks's right-hand man for years. He had benefited from the way things were run, and he had no interest in seeing the store change under new leadership. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. When the call connected, his voice was low, deliberate. Brooks, you won't believe what's happening in your store right now. A pause, then, a slow, amused chuckle on the other end of the line. Tell me everything. Brooks sat in the corner booth of a rundown diner just outside town, stirring his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the cracked vinyl seats. Across from him, Mark Evans sat stiffly, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds, as if expecting someone to walk in and catch them. Brooks didn't share his paranoia. He had spent too many years in control to start looking over his shoulder now. So, Brooks said, setting his spoon down with a soft clink. They really gave my job to that cripple? Mark shifted uncomfortably. Jim's running things now. Yeah. Brooks let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. A guy who can't even walk straight is supposed to lead. That store's going to crash and burn. Mark hesitated before speaking. Ethan Carter put him there himself. The name alone was enough to sour Brooks's mood further. Ethan Carter, CEO, billionaire, and now, apparently, a man who had nothing better to do than play hero in a grocery store. Brooks exhaled through his nose, tapping a finger against his coffee mug. Then we don't just take Jim down. We make sure Carter regrets ever stepping foot in that store. Mark leaned in, lowering his voice. What are you thinking? Brooks smirked. We turn the employees against him. Make them doubt him. Make him doubt himself. Jim Walker was a former soldier, a man who had survived worse than store politics. But even the strongest men could be worn down from the inside. And that's exactly what Brooks intended to do. The first cracks started appearing 2 days later. Employees who had once been neutral toward Jim suddenly seemed skeptical of his leadership. Conversations in the break room grew quieter when he entered. Some workers conveniently forgot to follow proper stocking procedures, leading to misplaced inventory and customer complaints. Mark made sure to stoke the fire wherever he could. Man, I don't know, he'd say casually, leaning against a shelf as he spoke to a small group of employees. Jim was just a stock guy last week. Now he's our boss? Feels like Carter's just trying to make himself look good. Someone else would chime in. Yeah, and we're the ones paying for it. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. The first real test came when a major customer order was delayed. A business client had placed a bulk order, hundreds of units of product that should have been processed and ready for pickup. But somehow, somewhere along the line, the order had gone missing. Jim found out when the client called. Furious, he immediately went to the records, searching for any sign of what had happened. The logs showed that the shipment had arrived. The system showed it had been stocked. But when Jim checked the inventory, the shelves were empty. The product was gone. Panic settled deep in his gut. By the time Mark arrived with a knowing smirk, employees were already talking. Tough break, boss, Mark said, loud enough for a few workers nearby to hear. I guess these things happen when management changes hands too fast. Jim clenched his jaw. I need a list of who was responsible for handling the shipment. Mark shrugged. Sure, but, people are already saying maybe this wouldn't have happened if Brooks was still in charge. Jim stiffened. Mark patted him on the shoulder as he walked away, his voice dripping with false sympathy. No pressure, though. By the time Ethan arrived later that afternoon, the tension in the store was palpable. He had been monitoring the situation from a distance, letting Jim find his footing. But now he could see that something was wrong. Employees looked uneasy. Some avoided Jim entirely, while others whispered just out of earshot. Ethan stepped into the stockroom and found Jim staring at a clipboard, his posture rigid. "Walk me through what happened," Ethan said. Jim didn't look up. "A bulk order went missing. It was here. Now it's not." Ethan glanced around. "And you think it was stolen?" Jim shook his head. "I don't know, but I know this. People are losing faith in me. And honestly, I don't blame them." Ethan studied him for a long moment before speaking. "That's exactly what they want." Jim finally looked up. "Who?" Ethan's expression was unreadable. "The people who don't want you here. The ones who think Brooks should still be running this place." Jim exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that I lost an order." Ethan's voice was calm, steady. "Then let's find it." They pulled up security footage in Ethan's office, fast-forwarding through hours of grainy black and white recordings. And then, at 2:37 a.m. the night before, they saw it. Two men, hoodies pulled low, faces barely visible, one of them punching a code into the stockroom keypad, the other moving quickly, loading boxes onto a dolly. The footage cut out briefly, a camera malfunction. Or maybe something more intentional. When it came back, the men were gone. Jim leaned forward. "That's an inside job." Ethan nodded. "And someone knew exactly what they were doing." Jim sat back in his chair, a sinking feeling in his stomach. "You think it was Mark?" Ethan didn't answer right away. "I think Mark isn't working alone." Across town, in the dimly lit back room of a bar, Brooks leaned back in his chair, his phone pressed to his ear. "Tell me something good," he said. A voice on the other end chuckled. "The store's already a mess. Jim's drowning." Brooks smirked, swirling the drink in his hand. "Good, let's keep it that way." Then, lowering his voice, he added, "And make sure Carter keeps looking the wrong direction. We still have another move to make." Ethan Carter stood in his office, staring at the reports spread across his desk. Numbers didn't lie, but they could be manipulated. And that's exactly what was happening at Horizon Mart. The store was slipping into chaos. Orders were going missing. Customer complaints had spiked. Employee morale was sinking faster than he had anticipated. On paper, it looked like Jim Walker was failing as store manager. But Ethan knew better. This wasn't a coincidence, it was sabotage. For the past 24 hours, he had combed through transaction records, shipment logs, and internal communications. Somewhere in the mess, there had to be a pattern, a mistake, a clue that would lead him to whoever was pulling the strings. Then, he found it, a series of small, seemingly insignificant edits made to outgoing orders. Some shipments were rerouted at the last minute, others marked as delayed, even though they had already arrived. The changes weren't major enough to set off alarms, but when added together, they created a logistical nightmare. Every single adjustment had one thing in common. Mark Evans. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had suspected Mark was involved from the moment Jim started facing resistance. But now, he had proof. The question was, how much further did this go? And more importantly, was Brooks still pulling the strings from the outside? He couldn't afford to make a move just yet. If he confronted Mark now, it would only give the man time to cover his tracks. No, Ethan needed to be certain. He needed Mark to expose himself completely. It was time to set a trap. Meanwhile, Jim Walker was barely holding things together. Everywhere he turned, there was another problem. Employees were slow to follow his instructions. Some outright ignored him. Mistakes were piling up. Inventory miscounts, scheduling errors, misplaced orders. And no matter how hard he tried to fix things, they kept slipping through his fingers. It wasn't just the logistical issues. It was the whispers. "He's in over his head. The store's never been this bad before. Maybe Brooks wasn't so bad after all." Jim had fought in war zones. He had faced enemies that wanted to kill him. But this was different. This was a battle he didn't know how to fight. And it was starting to feel like he was losing. Emily was the only one who seemed to notice. She had been watching Jim closely, seeing the way he carried himself, the exhaustion in his face, the frustration he tried to hide. That evening, as Jim sat alone in the break room, staring blankly at a stack of incident reports. She slid into the chair across from him. They want you to quit. You know. Jim blinked, looking up. What? Emily leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. The people who are making this harder than it has to be. They want you to fail. They want you to walk away so they can say, "See, he was never supposed to be in charge." Jim rubbed a hand down his face. Yeah, well, maybe they're right. Emily frowned. You don't actually believe that? Jim didn't respond. She narrowed her eyes. Look, I get it. You feel like you're fighting a losing battle. But if you walk away now, they win. And you know better than anyone that you don't let the enemy win. Jim let out a breath. This isn't a war, Emily. She tilted her head. Isn't it? That made him pause. She stood up, tapping her knuckles lightly against the table before walking away. Jim sat there for a long time, turning her words over in his head. Ethan watched the security footage with sharp eyes. He had set up a monitoring system in his office, tracking Mark's movements without tipping him off. And just as he suspected, Mark had been spending a lot of time near the shipment records. Tonight, he had done something different. Instead of his usual quiet manipulations, Mark had openly confronted a group of employees. Stirring the pot, he had planted doubt, made it seem like Jim was the cause of all their problems. The employees didn't push back. If anything, some of them looked convinced. It was time to put an end to this. That night, Ethan called Jim into his office. Jim entered hesitantly, still looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. Ethan wasted no time, turning the monitor toward him. Jim leaned in, watching the footage play. At first, he looked confused. Then, his expression darkened. Mark, he muttered. Ethan nodded. He's been manipulating the system. Quietly at first, but now he's getting bolder. Jim straightened. So we confront him? Ethan shook his head. Not yet. We let him think he's still in control. And then, when he's at his most confident, we take everything from him. Jim exhaled, rubbing his jaw. You really think I can handle this? Ethan gave him a steady look. I never put the wrong person in charge. Jim, you're the right man for this job. The only question is, do you want to fight for it? Jim clenched his fists. The doubt that had been eating away at him started to fade, replaced by something else, something stronger. Determination. I'm in, he said. Ethan nodded, satisfied. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, Jim was ready to fight. Ethan Carter stood at the head of the conference table, surveying the faces in front of him. The room was packed with department heads, supervisors, and key staff members, everyone responsible for keeping Horizon Mart running. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that came when people sensed something big was about to happen. He kept his voice measured. I called this meeting to get an honest evaluation of where we stand. We've had disruptions, we've had setbacks, but we're not here to point fingers, we're here to find solutions. His gaze flicked to Mark Evans, seated near the middle of the table. Mark was composed, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but Ethan had spent too many years studying men like him. The slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped idly against his notepad. Those were the signs of a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. Ethan turned to one of the senior floor supervisors. Let's start with logistics. Can someone walk me through the recent inventory inconsistencies? There was a pause before a woman named Linda, one of the more experienced managers, cleared her throat. We've had an unusual number of miscounts lately. A lot of shipments being marked as received but not matching what's in stock. Some of it's probably human error. But, she hesitated, it's happening too often to be a coincidence. Ethan nodded. That's what I thought. He let the silence stretch before adding. Starting next week, we're conducting a full internal audit. Every shipment, every transaction. The shift in the room was immediate. Some managers exchanged quick glances. Others scribbled notes. But Ethan was only watching one person. Mark. For the first time, the man's carefully maintained calm cracked. It was just a flicker, a tightening of the jaw. A quick inhale, but Ethan saw it. Mark was worried. Good. Jim Walker had never thought of himself as a strategist. His whole life, he had been the kind of man who did his job, followed orders, and worked as hard as he could. But after his conversation with Ethan, something clicked. He realized that this wasn't just about doing the work, it was about controlling the battlefield. So he changed tactics. Instead of trying to win people over with words, he started shifting the way things worked. First, he overhauled the way shipments were processed. Instead of relying on a single chain of approval, one that Mark had clearly been manipulating, Jim made sure that multiple employees signed off on every major inventory movement. That meant fewer opportunities for things to, accidentally, go missing. Then, he started pulling employees aside for one-on-one conversations. He didn't lecture them. He didn't ask for their loyalty. He just listened. He let them air their frustrations, their doubts, their concerns, and slowly, they started to see him less as a man thrown into leadership and more as someone who genuinely wanted to fix things. Mark noticed, and he didn't like it. Jim could see the irritation creeping into his actions. The way he spoke louder in meetings. The way he tried to undermine Jim's decisions with small, snide remarks. The subtle manipulation was giving way to something more desperate. That was exactly what Jim wanted. The real test came 3 days later. A minor payroll issue had come up. Several employees' overtime hours hadn't been properly recorded. Normally, this would have been a simple fix. Just a matter of adjusting the time logs. But Mark saw an opportunity. In the middle of a shift meeting, he spoke up, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. Funny how these mistakes keep happening under new management. His voice was casual, but the implication was sharp. I guess experience really does count for something. A few employees chuckled under their breath. Others shifted uncomfortably, not wanting to get involved. Jim looked up from his clipboard, meeting Mark's gaze. That's a fair point, he said evenly, so let's talk about experience. The room quieted. Jim folded his arms. You've been here a while. Mark, you handled payroll before, didn't you? Mark hesitated, caught off guard. Yeah, so? If anyone should have caught this mistake before it became a problem, it's you. Jim let the words settle before adding. Unless, of course, you were too busy stirring up trouble to do your job. The employees watching exchanged glances. A few nodded. Mark's face darkened. Jim didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just turned back to his clipboard. Now, let's fix the actual issue. Mark didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. That night, Mark made a call. The line rang twice before Brooks picked up. Tell me you have good news. Mark ran a hand through his hair. It's not working. Jim's adapting. The employees are starting to trust him. There was a pause. Then Brooks's voice came back. Colder this time. Then we push harder. Mark exhaled sharply. Ethan's running an audit. If we don't shut this down now, we're both screwed. Another silence. Then, Brooks chuckled. Then it's time for me to step in. Mark frowned. What does that mean? Brooks ignored the question. I need you to set up a meeting. I'll handle the rest. Mark hesitated, but he didn't argue. Fine. When? Brooks smiled. Tonight. On the other side of town. In the dimly lit corner of a high-end restaurant. Brooks took a sip of his whiskey and glanced at the man sitting across from him. The man was in his mid-50s. Well-dressed, with a look of quiet authority. He wasn't the kind of person who spoke unless he had something worth saying. Brooks set his glass down. We have a problem. The man raised an eyebrow. I thought you said Carter was handling it. Brooks's expression hardened. Carter's the problem. He's not just cleaning up the store, he's digging too deep. If he keeps going, he's going to find things we don't want him to find. The man exhaled through his nose. Considering. Then stop him. Brooks smirked. That's the plan. The man nodded, then leaned forward slightly. And if he doesn't back off? Brooks's smile didn't fade. Then we make sure he doesn't have a choice. Ethan Carter leaned against his desk, rubbing his temple as he scanned the report on his laptop. The numbers, the names, the patterns, they all pointed to something bigger than just Brooks. The sabotage in the store wasn't random. It wasn't just about one disgruntled former manager trying to claw his way back. Someone above Brooks had been pulling the strings for years. Ethan had suspected as much. But now, he had proof. With the help of Horizon Mart's legal team, he had quietly requested a review of personnel decisions over the last 3 years. Promotions, transfers, disciplinary actions, anything that might reveal a hidden hand at work. And there it was. Brooks's rise through the company had been anything but natural. Every step of his career, from department supervisor to store manager, had been facilitated by a single name. Richard Caldwell. Ethan exhaled slowly. Caldwell wasn't just another executive. He was one of Horizon Mart's regional directors, overseeing operations across multiple states. A man with influence, power, and, most concerningly, a reason to keep Brooks in play. If Caldwell had been protecting Brooks, then this was more than a petty power struggle. This was corruption at a corporate level. Ethan shut his laptop and reached for his phone. It was time to find out exactly what game Caldwell was playing. Across town, in the dimly lit back office of a high-end restaurant, Brooks slouched in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass. He had spent the past few weeks watching from the sidelines, waiting for Richard to make a move. And now, finally, the call had come. Richard Caldwell sat across from him, his suit impeccable, his expression unreadable. He had the air of a man who had never once worried about losing control. Brooks, on the other hand, was barely keeping his temper in check. "I lost my job," Brooks spat. "I lost my store, and you just sat there." Richard raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by the outburst. "And yet, you're still sitting here, drinking on my dime, instead of crawling back to whatever hole Ethan Carter left you in." Brooks clenched his jaw but said nothing. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Ethan is more of a problem than we anticipated. He was supposed to play his role, collect his profits, and let things run as they always have. Instead, he decided to interfere." Brooks scoffed. "Interfere? He humiliated me. He tore apart everything we built." Richard sighed. "No, Daniel, he tore apart what you built. I simply allowed you to operate because it benefited me." Brooks's fingers tightened around his glass. Richard pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "But now, it's time to turn things back in our favor." Brooks hesitated before opening it. Inside was a collection of documents, emails, internal reports, financial statements, and at the very top, a printed transcript of a conversation. Brooks skimmed the words, his pulse quickening. It was a recording, Ethan's voice, but the way it was cut. Brooks looked up, a slow grin spreading across his face. "This makes him look real bad." Richard smirked. "That's the idea." Meanwhile, at Horizon Mart, Jim Walker was beginning to suspect that the battle wasn't just happening in the store. He had been keeping an eye on Mark Evans ever since Ethan's warning. And the more he watched, the more convinced he became that Mark was working against them. Late that night, after most employees had gone home, Jim found himself in the back office, scrolling through security logs. The store's email system had been accessed from an unauthorized device multiple times over the past week. Always during off hours, always tied to orders that had mysteriously gone wrong. Jim frowned and clicked on the most recent entry. The user ID was generic, something Mark could have easily used to cover his tracks. But what caught Jim's attention was where the emails had been sent. Not to Brooks, to an unknown recipient. Before he could dig deeper, the system locked him out. An error message flashed across the screen. Jim muttered a curse under his breath. Someone had just erased the trail. The next morning, chaos hit before Ethan even stepped into his office. A major financial news site had published an article accusing him of abuse of power. The headline was designed to cause maximum damage. Billionaire CEO Ethan Carter under fire for employee intimidation and nepotism. The story was filled with half-truths and outright lies. It claimed Ethan had fired Brooks for personal reasons. That he had promoted Jim out of favoritism, not merit. That employees were afraid to speak out against him for fear of retaliation. And at the bottom of the article, there was an audio clip. A heavily edited conversation that made it sound like Ethan was threatening employees into silence. By the time he arrived at Horizon Mart, the damage had already begun. Employees were whispering. Some gave him wary glances. And worst of all, the board of directors was demanding an internal review. Ethan clenched his fists. Someone was trying to take him down. And he had a damn good idea who it was. Jim and Emily watched the news from the break room, disbelief written all over their faces. "This is a setup," Emily muttered. "A complete setup." Jim's mind was racing. The timing was too perfect. The article, the recording, The sudden shift in public perception, this wasn't just an attack. This was a calculated strike. Jim turned to Emily. We need to find out who planted this story. Emily nodded. And we need to do it fast. Back in his office, Ethan sat behind his desk, staring at his phone. He had expected resistance. He had expected Brooks to fight back. But he hadn't expected this. A corporate war. And Richard Caldwell had just made his opening move. Ethan Carter had faced corporate battles before. But this was different. This wasn't just about business, it was personal. Richard Caldwell had played his hand, using the media to smear his name. And if Ethan didn't act fast, the damage would be permanent. Sitting in his office, he scrolled through the article that had gone viral overnight. Words like abuse of power and unethical leadership flashed across the screen. Each sentence crafted to chip away at his reputation. The manipulated audio clip was particularly damning. It made him sound like a tyrant. A man threatening his employees into submission. Ethan set his phone down and exhaled slowly. They wanted him out, but they had underestimated him. The first step in fighting back was reclaiming control of the narrative. Ethan picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Daniel Hayes. A voice answered. Dan, it's Ethan Carter, he said, leaning back in his chair. I need a favor. Hayes was an investigative journalist. One of the few Ethan trusted. He didn't take sides, he reported facts. And right now, facts were exactly what Ethan needed. There's a story being pushed about me. Ethan continued. It's a lie, and I have proof. A pause. Then, Hayes said, send me what you've got. Ethan smiled faintly. Check your inbox. While Ethan worked the media, Jim and Emily were piecing together the truth from within. They had spent hours tracking the suspicious email activity, following the digital breadcrumbs left behind by Mark Evans. The more they dug, the clearer the connection became. Mark had been communicating directly with Brooks. Jim sat at his desk, staring at the screen. He was never working alone. Emily, leaning over his shoulder, nodded. There's something else. Look at this. She pulled up a separate log, one that showed Mark had accessed company financial records. Jim frowned. Why would he need financial records? Emily clicked on one of the files. Because he wasn't just working with Brooks. Jim's eyes narrowed as he read the email header. Jim let out a low whistle. That's the missing piece. Emily grabbed her phone. We need to get this to Ethan. An hour later, Mark Evans walked into Ethan's office, unaware that he was walking into his own execution. Ethan sat behind his desk, calm, composed. Behind him, the large conference screen was turned off, for now. Have a seat, Mark, Ethan said smoothly. Mark hesitated, then sat down. Is this about the article? Look, I had nothing to do with. Ethan pressed a button on his keyboard, and the conference screen lit up. On it, a series of emails, transaction logs, and security reports appeared, all tied to Mark. Ethan didn't speak. He just watched as Mark's face drained of color. Mark started, but Ethan held up a hand. Before you lie to me, remember that I already know the truth, Ethan said. Mark swallowed hard. I didn't have a choice. Ethan tilted his head. No, Mark, you did have a choice. And you chose to betray this company. Mark shifted in his seat. Caldwell, he's too powerful. You don't go against men like him. Ethan leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. Then it's a good thing I'm not like you. A knock at the door. 2 security guards stepped inside. Ethan didn't need to say a word. Mark stood abruptly, panic flashing in his eyes. Wait, Ethan, listen, I can help. Get him out of my building, Ethan said. The guards took Mark by the arms and escorted him out. Ethan watched him go, then turned back to the screen. Mark was out, but Caldwell was still in play. And Caldwell was far more dangerous. Richard Caldwell sat in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Horizon Mart's corporate headquarters, watching as the board members murmured amongst themselves. The article about Ethan had done its job. Public trust in his leadership had been shaken. And now, it was time to finish what they had started. Caldwell tapped his fingers on the table, waiting until the room fell silent. Then, he spoke. It's clear that recent events have cast doubt on Ethan Carter's ability to lead this company. He said smoothly, we cannot afford to ignore these allegations. I propose that the board take immediate action to evaluate Ethan's position as CEO. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. One of the directors, an older man named Charles Whitmore, cleared his throat. And what exactly do you suggest, Richard? Caldwell folded his hands together. An internal vote. If the board determines that Ethan is no longer fit to serve, we remove him. Silence. Then, a few nods. Caldwell hid his smile. It was already in motion. As the meeting adjourned, he stepped away to make a call. Brooks answered on the first ring. Be ready, Caldwell said. Ethan Carter won't be CEO much longer. Brooks chuckled. About time. Caldwell smirked. This game is over. Back at Horizon Mart, Jim stood with Ethan in his office. The war wasn't over yet. But something had changed. For the first time since taking over as store manager, Jim felt ready. He met Ethan's gaze and nodded. If they want a war, then let's give them one. Ethan smiled. That's exactly what I was thinking. Ethan Carter sat at the long mahogany table, the weight of the room pressing down on him. The boardroom of Horizon Mart's corporate headquarters was filled with the company's most powerful figures, executives, legal advisors, and, at the head of the table, Richard Caldwell. The meeting had been called in response to the allegations against Ethan. The smear campaign had done its job, casting doubt over his leadership. Now, the board wanted answers. Caldwell, ever the strategist, struck first. Ladies and gentlemen, he began smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. We all understand the importance of stability in a company of this size. And yet, in the past few weeks, we've seen nothing but turmoil. His gaze swept the room, landing on Ethan with calculated precision. Under Ethan Carter's leadership, we have witnessed rash personnel decisions, public scandals, and internal chaos. A CEO's primary responsibility is to protect this company, its employees, and its reputation. And I ask you, has he done that? A murmur rippled through the board members. Some exchanged glances, while others remained stone-faced, waiting for the inevitable clash. Caldwell pressed forward. Our stock value has wavered. Employees are uneasy. And now, the media is questioning our integrity. We cannot afford to ignore these warning signs. He folded his hands together. For the sake of the company, I propose an immediate evaluation of Carter's position as CEO. Ethan waited a beat before speaking. If you're done, Richard, I'd like to present my case. Caldwell gestured toward him with a smirk. By all means. Ethan stood, taking his time as he reached for a remote. The massive screen at the front of the boardroom flickered to life. I won't waste your time defending my reputation, Ethan said, his voice measured. Instead, I'd like to talk about what's really been happening inside Horizon Mart. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen: employee promotions, transfer records, and financial transactions. Ethan tapped a key, highlighting one name over and over again. Richard Caldwell personally approved every major decision that led to the instability we're seeing today. Ethan continued, from appointing unqualified managers to manipulating supply chains. This wasn't mismanagement, it was deliberate. The murmur in the room grew louder. Ethan clicked again, revealing a breakdown of manipulated inventory records. You've all heard about the recent disruptions in our stores, he said, orders disappearing, shipments being rerouted. This wasn't incompetence, it was sabotage. A new set of documents filled the screen, emails between Mark Evans and Brooks, detailing their coordinated effort to create internal disarray. And here's where it gets interesting, Ethan added, turning toward Caldwell. Every single one of these changes benefited one person. You, Richard. Caldwell's confident smirk faltered for the first time. That's absurd, he said sharply. You're fabricating this to cover your own failures. Ethan smiled faintly. I thought you might say that. He pressed one final button. The room filled with the sound of a recorded conversation. At first, it was just Brooks's voice, low and agitated. I did what you asked. I moved the pieces. Caused enough trouble to get Carter out. Then came Caldwell's unmistakable reply. Good, but it's not enough. The board needs a reason to turn against him. We make the employees doubt him first. Then the public. Once that happens, we'll force his resignation. A heavy silence fell over the room. Caldwell's face went pale. One of the board members, an older woman named Margaret Whitmore, folded her hands in front of her. Richard, do you have an explanation for this? Caldwell opened his mouth, but for the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. Whitmore turned to the others. I move for an immediate suspension of Richard Caldwell, pending further investigation. A second voice spoke. I second that motion. Hands began to raise, one after another. Caldwell's expression twisted in fury. You can't do this, he snapped. This is manipulation. Whitmore's voice was calm. No, Richard, what you did was manipulation. This is accountability. Ethan watched as security was called in. Caldwell stood, his fists clenched, his face red with anger. This isn't over, he growled as the guards approached. Ethan met his gaze evenly. No, Richard, it's just beginning. As Caldwell was escorted out of the boardroom, Ethan exhaled slowly. He had won this round. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Because somewhere out there, Brooks was still watching. And a cornered man was always the most dangerous. Daniel Brooks paced inside the dimly lit motel room, his fingers tightening around a cigarette he had yet to light. The walls were peeling. The air smelled like stale beer. And the flickering neon sign outside the window cast an eerie red glow across the room. He had spent years climbing his way up, securing his position, only for Ethan Carter to rip it all away in a matter of weeks. Now, Richard Caldwell was gone, suspended, disgraced, powerless to protect him, and Brooks was alone, but not done. The phone on the table buzzed. A message. Final chance. Deliver, and you'll be taken care of. Brooks exhaled sharply. His mystery benefactor had stayed in the shadows. But the message was clear. If he wanted a future, he had one last job to do. He reached for the envelope that had been slipped under his door earlier that night. Inside was a wad of crisp $100 bills and a simple note. Turn the employees against Carter. Make it public. Make it messy. Brooks smiled. This, he could do. The next morning, Horizon Mart's employees arrived to an unusual sight. Flyers littered the breakroom tables and employee lockers, each one plastered with bold, damning accusations against Ethan Carter. Words like corruption, favoritism, and union busting screamed from the pages. By noon, rumors were already spreading. A group of discontented employees, some old allies of Brooks, others simply frustrated with the recent turmoil, began whispering about a strike. Mark Evans might have been taken out, but Brooks had found new pawns. And this time, he wasn't just stirring the pot, he was setting the whole kitchen on fire. Jim Walker leaned against the counter, watching a small group of employees muttering near the stockroom. He had been noticing the shift in atmosphere all morning. The stolen glances, the hushed conversations, the way certain employees stiffened when he walked by. Something was happening. Emily appeared beside him, arms crossed. You feel it too, don't you? Jim nodded. Yeah, someone's pushing them toward something. Emily hesitated, then said, Brooks. Jim let out a slow breath. We need proof. By mid-afternoon, it happened. A group of 10 employees stormed onto the main floor, holding signs, chanting slogans. Customers froze. Managers scrambled. Cameramen and reporters appeared like vultures, capturing every second of the uprising. Fair wages, no favoritism. One protester shouted. Ethan Carter is a fraud. Another added. Jim clenched his jaw as he stepped toward the crowd. What the hell is this? One of the employees, a man named Travis, sneered. We're standing up for ourselves. You think you can just push us around? Jim's voice remained calm. No one's pushing you around. But someone is using you. Travis faltered, but before he could respond, a sleek black car pulled up near the entrance. Ethan Carter stepped out, dressed in his usual sharp suit, his expression unreadable. He walked straight into the chaos without hesitation. The cameras turned to him instantly. Mr. Carter, one reporter began, shoving a microphone toward him. What do you say to the employees who claim you've been running this company like a dictatorship? Ethan didn't take the bait. Instead, he addressed the employees directly. If you have concerns, I want to hear them. But I also want to make sure you know the full story. He pulled his phone from his pocket and, with a simple tap, projected a screen onto the store's overhead monitor. Transaction records, payments made to certain employees, Travis among them. A stunned silence settled over the group. Jim stepped forward, his voice steady. These are direct payments made to several of you over the last 48 hours. Not from Horizon Mart, not from Ethan Carter, but from Daniel Brooks. Murmurs spread. That's a lie, Travis snapped. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Is it? Another tap on his phone. A pre-recorded conversation began to play. Brooks's voice filled the air. You get them angry, you get them loud, and you make sure the cameras are rolling. Carter's done. He won't recover from this. Travis's face paled. Others in the group looked uneasy. One of the younger employees, a woman named Maria, stepped forward. You paid us? She asked, her voice shaking. This wasn't real? Ethan's expression softened slightly. It was real for you. But it wasn't for him. He used you. More whispers. Employees exchanged looks. The crowd wasn't just losing momentum, it was unraveling. Then, a commotion near the parking lot. Brooks. He had been watching from a distance. But now, realizing the game was up, he turned to leave. Jim reacted instantly. Stop him. Security moved in, cutting Brooks off before he could disappear. The former manager held up his hands. What? You got nothing on me. Ethan walked toward him, slow and deliberate. We have everything on you. Brooks. Jim nodded toward security. Get him out of here. As Brooks was led away, the tension in the air shifted. The employees who had been manipulated looked lost, embarrassed. Ethan sighed. If you have real concerns, I'm willing to listen, but not like this, not through deception. The crowd slowly dispersed. The cameras kept rolling, but the story had changed. And this time, Ethan was the one in control of the narrative. As the sun set, Jim sat in the break room, rubbing his temples. That was close. Emily sat across from him, shaking her head. Too close. Ethan leaned against the doorway. We neutralized Brooks, but Caldwell hasn't made his next move yet. Jim frowned. You think he will? Ethan's gaze darkened. Men like him don't lose quietly. Jim exhaled. Then we get ready. Ethan nodded. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The moment Daniel Brooks was led out of Horizon Mart in handcuffs, the store erupted in murmurs. Employees who had once followed his lead now stood in stunned silence. Some whispering to each other, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Brooks had tried to run, tried to push through the exit before security stopped him cold. But there was nowhere left to go. His influence, his schemes, his alliances, all of it had crumbled in real time. Ethan Carter stood near the entrance, watching the scene unfold. His face remained neutral, but inside, he felt the weight of what had just happened. One battle was over, but another loomed on the horizon. As the police officer closed the back door of the squad car, Brooks turned his head, locking eyes with Ethan through the window. His expression wasn't one of defeat. It was one of warning. Then, the car pulled away. Jim Walker exhaled beside Ethan. Well, he muttered, that's one problem taken care of. Ethan didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the disappearing taillights. Yeah, he said finally. 1. That evening, the Horizon Mart board of directors gathered in a sleek conference room. Their faces tense. The emergency meeting had been called in the wake of Brooks's arrest. But the real discussion wasn't about him. It was about Ethan, seated at the end of the long table. Ethan waited as murmurs filled the room. Some board members looked at him with newfound respect, others with lingering doubt. And then, at the head of the table, Richard Caldwell leaned forward. Let's not pretend today's events were some great victory. Richard said smoothly, we have a company in turmoil. Customers questioning our stability, and headlines painting us as dysfunctional. He glanced around the table, his tone measured, persuasive. And who is responsible for that instability? Ethan folded his hands together. You. Richard let out a low chuckle. You can't honestly believe that. Ethan leaned back, tapping the folder in front of him. I don't believe it. I know it. With a nod, he gestured to the screen behind him. Documents appeared, emails, transaction logs, financial reports. Daniel Brooks didn't act alone. Ethan continued. He was protected, encouraged, and when things got messy, someone paid to cover his tracks. Richard remained silent, but his fingers tapped against the table. Ethan clicked again, and another document filled the screen. A direct payment from one of Richard's offshore accounts, wired to a consulting firm that had funneled money to Brooks. Gasps filled the room. Ethan turned to the board. This is what you were protecting? A man who used company funds to shield corruption, who manipulated financial records, intimidated employees, and nearly tore this company apart from the inside? One of the older board members, Charles Whitmore, leaned forward. Is this true, Richard? Richard scoffed. These are circumstantial at best. Ethan pressed another button. This time, a voice recording played. Richard's own voice filled the room. Brooks is reckless, but we need him. Carter won't see it coming until it's too late. The boardroom fell into silence. Then, Whitmore spoke again, his voice firm. I move to terminate Richard Caldwell from his position. Effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the room. One by one, hands went up. Richard Caldwell, for the first time in years, looked truly stunned. This is a mistake, he snapped. A massive. Whitmore cut him off. Security will escort you out. Ethan stood as two security guards entered the room. Richard glared at him, his jaw tight, but there was nothing left to say. As the guards led him to the door, Richard turned his head slightly, his voice low. You have no idea what you've started. Ethan met his gaze. Neither do you. Then, Richard was gone. Later that night, Jim and Emily sat across from Ethan in his office. The lights were dim, the tension finally settling. So, Emily said, it's over? Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temple. Caldwell's out. Brooks is done. But that doesn't mean there aren't more like them. Jim leaned forward. Then we find them, and we make sure this never happens again. Ethan looked at him, a small smile forming. You sound like a man ready for more responsibility. Jim smirked. I've had a good teacher. The war wasn't over, but for now, the battlefield belonged to them. Horizon Mart had endured storms before, but never one quite like this. With Brooks disgraced and Richard Caldwell officially removed from the company, the dust was beginning to settle. Employees cautiously returned to their routines, though the tension of the past few weeks still lingered in the air. Ethan Carter stood before a room full of corporate executives and store managers. His presence commanding yet calm. We're not here to celebrate a victory, he said, scanning the room, because if we're being honest, we let this happen. The statement hung in the air. No one dared to refute it. For years, the wrong people have had control. People who put profits over people, who treated employees as disposable. That ends today. He turned to the screen behind him and clicked a button. A new set of policies appeared, displayed for all to see. 1. A direct, anonymous reporting system for employee grievances. No more fear of retaliation. 2. A structured pay raise system, ensuring fairness across all levels. 3. Mandatory leadership training for all managers, real leadership, not intimidation. Ethan let the words sink in before speaking again. We're not just fixing what was broken. We're building something better. A ripple of nods and murmurs spread across the room. For the first time in a long while, Horizon Mart felt like it was moving forward. Jim Walker stood near the front of the break room, looking at the employees who had once worked beside him. Only a few weeks ago, he had been one of them, ignored, underestimated. Now, he stood in front of them, not as their coworker, but as their leader. He swallowed hard before speaking. I'll be honest with you, he said. When Ethan offered me this job, I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I deserved it. A few heads nodded. They had seen Jim's struggle. They had seen the doubt in his eyes before. But leadership isn't about titles. It's not about how loud you can yell or how much power you have over people. It's about listening. It's about standing up for the right things, even when it's hard. Silence. Then, slowly, a few hands clapped. Then more. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding. Jim let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wasn't just a manager. He was their leader now. Ethan had barely sat down in his office when his phone chimed. An email. No sender. No subject line. Just a single sentence. Brooks and Richard were just the beginning. If you want the truth, dig deeper. Attached was a file. Rows of financial transactions, all linked to Horizon Mart. Ethan's grip tightened on the mouse. The numbers didn't just show corruption. They pointed to something much bigger. Something still hidden. He exhaled, standing up and walking to the window. Below, the city stretched out before him. Alive, moving, There was more to this fight. And now, he was ready for it. Ethan Carter sat alone in his office, the glow of the city skyline casting long shadows across his desk. The document on his screen was damning. Millions of dollars siphoned through Horizon Mart's supply chain, rerouted into offshore accounts. The email had warned him. Brooks and Richard were only the beginning. Now, staring at the tangled mess of transactions, he realized just how deep this corruption ran. Richard Caldwell had been powerful. But this was something else entirely. A name kept appearing in the financial reports. A name that had stayed under the radar for years. Howard Langley, the company's chief financial officer. And if these numbers were correct, he wasn't just a participant in the corruption. He was the architect. Jim Walker frowned at the numbers flashing across the screen. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered. Emily leaned in, tracing a finger along a pattern in the transactions. "Look at this. The money moves in cycles, first through shell companies, then through procurement deals, and finally offshore." Jim shook his head. "That means it's been going on for years. We weren't looking at fraud. We were looking at a whole system designed to bleed Horizon Mart dry." Ethan exhaled, his jaw tightening. And Howard Langley was the one pulling the strings. Emily's eyes flickered with concern. Caldwell was reckless. Brooks was desperate. But Langley? He's smart. He's methodical. If he knows we're coming, he'll bury everything. Ethan finished. Jim cracked his knuckles. "Then we hit him before he gets the chance." Howard Langley was a man of precision. His suits were always pressed, his words always measured, and his expressions rarely betrayed a single thought. So when he entered the executive conference room that afternoon, he carried himself as he always did, calm, composed, completely in control. Except today, Ethan was watching him differently. As discussions about the company's quarterly finances unfolded, Ethan studied the CFO's every move, the way his fingers tapped idly against his pen, the brief flickers of his gaze whenever procurement contracts were mentioned. Langley wasn't just running the books. He was hiding something in them. And he knew Ethan was looking. At one point, their eyes met across the table. For the first time in years, Langley hesitated, just for a second. But Ethan saw it. And he knew. Langley wasn't just another corrupt executive. He was the real enemy. That night, as the city hummed with late-night traffic, Ethan stood by his office window, staring out at the lights. A battle had ended, but a war had just begun. The first attack came swiftly. Early that morning, Horizon Mart's internal financial systems flagged a series of anomalies. Reports had been altered overnight, transactions reshuffled, discrepancies erased, and paper trails meticulously rearranged to cover up years of illicit activity. Howard Langley was already moving. Ethan Carter scanned the modified reports on his screen. It was a clear attempt to bury the truth before it could fully surface. A calculated counterstrike, and a warning. An hour later, Ethan received another message, this time not through official channels. A plain white envelope sat on his desk, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in bold letters. "Knowing too much isn't always a good thing, Ethan." He exhaled slowly, staring at the words. It wasn't just a message. It was a threat. He had faced corporate betrayals before. But this was different. This was personal. And it meant he was getting close. Howard Langley didn't become CFO by being careless. He had built his empire within Horizon Mart brick by brick, securing allies, eliminating threats, and ensuring his financial web remained untouchable. Caldwell had been reckless. Brooks had been impulsive. Howard was neither. Seated in his high-rise office, he gazed out at the city below, his fingers idly tapping against his desk. He had known Ethan Carter would be a problem. What he hadn't expected was just how persistent he would be. He picked up his phone and dialed. "It's time to tighten the leash," he said smoothly. "Make sure the board remembers where their interests lie." Ethan needed an ally, someone within the board who still valued integrity. That afternoon, he met with Jacob Miller, one of the longest-serving members of Horizon Mart's executive committee. Jacob was a man of principle, one of the few who had remained neutral throughout the chaos. But now, neutrality wasn't an option. Ethan placed the financial records on the table between them. "This is what Langley has been doing," he said, "for years." Jacob leaned forward, scanning the documents. As his eyes moved over the figures, his expression darkened. He hesitated. If this is true, then Langley has stolen millions from the company. And no one saw it. They didn't want to see it. Ethan corrected. They were paid not to. Jacob exhaled sharply. If you take this to the board now, you'll need more than numbers. You'll need undeniable proof. Ethan nodded. Then we find it. As night fell, Ethan sat alone in his office, his mind racing through possibilities. Langley had resources, influence, and enough leverage to make life very difficult. But Ethan had something stronger. He had the truth, and he wasn't backing down. And that's the power of true leadership, standing up for what's right. Even when no one expects it, Ethan didn't just expose corruption, he set a new standard for respect and accountability. So, what would you do if you witnessed injustice like this? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories that reveal what's really happening behind closed doors.